Okay, so you want to really get to the bottom of big ideas, right? But who has the time to spend weeks poring over dense philosophical texts?
Right.
Well, think of this deep dive into Louis Althusser as your shortcut, a way to grasp the impact of a thinker who sparked some serious debate back in the mid 20th century.
Yeah, Althusser was a Marxist philosopher who really exploded onto the intellectual scene in the 1960s with his project.
To revitalize Marxist thought.
Yeah, and he wanted to make it, philosophically respectable, a real player in the academic world. He was aiming for nothing less than a philosophical reboot.
And he definitely got people talking, right? But then things kind of cooled down after the 1970s.
Yeah, that's true.
The theoretical landscape shifted, and I think his personal life had a big impact too. There were some really difficult events that he went through.
That's right. But the thing I find so fascinating is the staying power of his theory of ideology.
Yeah, that's become super influential.
Absolutely. It's foundational across the social sciences and humanities now. It's everywhere.
Yeah, influencing post-Marxist philosophy, analytic Marxism, critical realism, even discourse analysis. It's pretty remarkable how much traction that specific set of ideas gained.
It really is.
And now it seems like there's this renewed interest in Althusser.
It does.
More of his writings are becoming available. Plus, there's this need to grapple with our current socioeconomic challenges through a more critical lens. So scholars are going back and revisiting Althusser's whole project with fresh eyes.
Yeah, it's like a reassessment is happening.
So for this deep dive, what's our roadmap? Where do we start?
Well, we'll trace Althusser's intellectual journey,
Okay.
starting with those early influences that shaped his thinking.
Yeah.
Then we'll delve into his most influential period, his classic work. Then we'll explore those revisions he made later on.
Yeah.
And finally, we'll touch on his last phase, his work on something called aleatory materialism.
Mm.
Think of it as mapping out the key stages of a really influential philosophical journey.
Okay, let's go all the way back to the beginning. So, Louis Althusser was born in Algeria in 1918 to a French family.
Right.
Seems like his early life was pretty, well, stable, middle class.
Yeah, but his family moved to Marseille and then to Lyon. He excelled in school at the Lycée du Parc, got involved in the Scouts. But what's really interesting, especially for a philosopher like you, is the intellectual stuff that shaped him early on.
Okay, yeah, tell me about that.
So he was deeply influenced by a few Catholic-leaning professors, guys like Jean Guitton, Jean Lacroix, Joseph Auers. He even joined a Catholic student group. And that engagement with Catholicism stuck with him in some ways, even after he later joined the Communist Party.
Wow, so you have this bright young mind, obviously sharp, deeply engaged with Catholic thought, and then at the same time, he's briefly involved in royalist politics in Lyon.
Yeah.
It's like he was testing out different ideological frameworks from a young age.
Absolutely. He was exploring. And then in 1939, he got into the École Normale Supérieure, the ENS in Paris.
Yeah, the ENS, that's a real breeding ground for major thinkers.
It is.
But then World War II breaks out,
Yeah, it was a huge interruption.
and he spends the next 5 years as a prisoner of war in northern Germany.
Right.
I mean, that's a huge chunk of his early adulthood. How did that experience impact him?
Profoundly. He actually credited the sense of solidarity in the POW camp as a turning point.
Hmm.
The collective action, the community he experienced there, it was really key in his turn towards communism.
I see.
You can get a glimpse of this in his prison writings, which are really fascinating. But sadly, this period also marked the beginning of his lifelong struggles with depression.
Oh, wow.
It was a really tough time for him.
So after the war, he's in his late 20s. He finally gets to the ENS.
Right.
He's preparing for the aggregation, that super difficult exam for academics. And intellectually, it seems like he's wrestling with this question of how to reconcile his earlier Christian beliefs with this new growing commitment to Marxism.
He is. He's trying to find a way to bring those two worlds together.
So what's the intellectual landscape like for him at this point?
Well, he's really into 19th century German idealism, Hegel and Marx. He's also engaging with progressive Christian thinkers. His master's thesis was actually on Hegel,
Oh, wow.
supervised by Gaston Bachelard, another big name. He passed the aggregation in 1948 and got a long-term position at the ENS as agrégé répétiteur.
Okay.
This is a pretty influential role.
Yeah.
He spent more than 3 decades there, shaping the minds of future generations of French philosophers. People like Alain Badiou, Pierre Bourdieu, even Michel Foucault. Imagine the intellectual energy in his seminars.
It's a pretty impressive teaching legacy.
It is.
And at the same time, he's getting more involved with the French Communist Party, right?
Is this?
And starting his relationship with Helene Reitman-Lagosian, who he later married.
Right.
And all the while, he's dealing with these ongoing bouts of depression and seeking treatment. It sounds like a really intense period of intellectual and personal growth, but also a lot of difficulty.
It was, definitely. In those early post-war years, he was really tricked to synthesize Christianity and Marxism.
Yeah.
He saw potential overlaps, especially in their ethical concerns. But eventually, his optimism about that faded. He concluded that only through communist action in the material world could those values he saw in Christianity really be achieved.
That's an interesting shift. So tell me about this early engagement with Hegel. It seems pretty central to his development. How did his views on Hegel change over time?
Okay, so in the late 1940s, he saw Hegel as offering a powerful way to understand how societies change.
Okay.
But his critiques of Hegel focused on this idea that the specific historical and political stuff Hegel analyzed didn't actually measure up to the transformative potential of Hegel's own dialectical method. He even used Marx's early critique of Hegel to make this point. But what's important is that, at this stage, Althusser wasn't drawing a sharp line between Hegel and Marx. He even considered the possibility that Marx might have made a similar mistake.
Interesting. So he's using Hegel's own ideas to critique both Hegel and potentially early Marx. That's a pretty nuanced position.
It is. But then, in the early 1950s, we see a big shift,
Okay.
a real decisive one. He starts aligning more with the orthodox, party-approved interpretation of Marxism. He embraces the idea that Marx broke with Hegel, that Marx inverted the Hegelian dialectic, that historical materialism is a science, and that the proletariat needs this Marxist science to guide them. Now, while these essays definitely echo the official party line, they also contain hints of Althusser's own more unique ideas about the nature of scientific knowledge and the relationship between theory and practice.
Yeah.
He was already incorporating some Maoist perspectives on this link too, which is interesting.
So at the same time, he's doing historical work on figures like Montesquieu and Feuerbach. How does this fit into his bigger project?
Well, his work on Montesquieu in the late 1950s is really helpful for understanding how he later approached Marx. He analyzed Montesquieu's focus on, quote, the concrete behavior of men as a move away from abstract idealism and towards a more scientific study of history. This kind of foreshadows Althusser's own insistence on the scientific nature of Marx's mature work.
I see.
He argued that while Montesquieu made some real advances, he was ultimately limited because he accepted the existing political order as the only possibility. Now, his work on Feuerbach was different.
Yeah, how so?
It aimed to clarify what Marx initially took from Feuerbach's critique of religion, so that Marx's later, much more radical departure in developing his own materialist philosophy could be more clearly understood. These historical studies were, in a way, laying the groundwork for his major contribution to Marxist theory in the 1960s.
Okay, so that brings us to Althusser's classic period. This is from 1961 to 1966. This is when he really made his mark, right? He offers this radical rereading of Marx and a very specific definition of what Marxist philosophy is. But this wasn't just some academic exercise, was it?
Not at all. This period was driven by a need to really engage with what was happening intellectually and politically within the French Communist Party at that time, and to provide what he saw as a scientific alternative to both the rigid dogmatism of Stalinism and the growing influence of more humanist interpretations of Marxism.
I see.
The late 1950s and early 60s were a time of real intellectual ferment in Europe, a questioning of that dominant Soviet-style Marxism-Leninism. Many intellectuals were on this search for the true essence of Marxist philosophy.
Yeah.
And they often looked to his earlier, more Hegelian-influenced and seemingly humanist writings to find it.
Okay, so how did Althusser step into this debate?
He challenged it head-on, right, in 1961 with his essay on the young Marx.
Yeah, okay.
He really took issue with this whole method of prioritizing Marx's early work, using that as the key to understand his entire philosophy. He argued that it was methodologically flawed and often driven by, underlying ideological assumptions. Instead, he proposed a completely different way to read Marx.
And this is where we get the famous concept of symptomatic reading, right?
Exactly.
Now, for our listeners who may not be familiar, could you break down what Althusser meant by that?
Okay, so symptomatic reading is not about just taking Marx's words at face value. It's not about creating some seamless, unbroken narrative throughout his entire body of work.
Right.
It's about uncovering that implicit philosophical framework operating within Marx's mature work, especially Capital. The stuff that's not explicitly stated but revealed through contradictions and silences in the way the text is structured.
Okay.
It's like a detective searching for clues or a psychoanalyst interpreting a patient's symptoms.
Yeah.
You're looking for those underlying dynamics, those unspoken
I
assumptions.
see.
Althusser drew inspiration from Spinoza's way of interpreting the Bible. He also looked to Freud, Lacan, and their understanding of how symptoms reveal unconscious structures. And even Marx's own engagement with classical political economy was an influence. He incorporated ideas from French historical epistemology as well, about how scientific disciplines develop.
Okay, so it's not just what Marx said, but what his work shows or implies through its structure that's key.
Exactly. And from this method, we get Althusser's theory of the break. He argued that there was a decisive rupture, a real epistemological break in Marx's intellectual development around 1845.
Okay.
His early writings, before this break, were still entangled with Hegelian and Feuerbachian anthropological concepts, focusing on ideas like human essence and alienation. But after the break, especially in his mature works after 1857, like Capital, Marx developed a fundamentally new approach. It was materialist, scientific, historical materialism.
So this wasn't just a minor shift. It was a total transformation in how he understood history and society.
It was a complete break.
But even in Capital, Althusser said that Marx's underlying philosophy, what he called dialectical materialism, was still largely unstated, like it was operating beneath the surface of his economic analysis.
That's right. He saw Capital as a rigorous scientific analysis of the capitalist mode of production. But that philosophical framework, dialectical materialism, which made this analysis possible, was there but implicit. It needed this symptomatic reading to really bring it to the forefront.
So that it could be examined philosophically.
Exactly.
And this brings us to Althusser's theory of knowledge, right? His epistemology.
Yeah.
He was really critical of what he called empiricist interpretations of Marx, whether they came from humanist Marxists or more orthodox ones.
He was. He thought they both fundamentally misunderstood how knowledge is produced.
Okay, so what was the problem with these empiricist readings?
Well, according to Althusser, they assumed that knowledge comes from a subject observing an object and abstracting its essence. Humanist Marxists would emphasize human agency, while orthodox Marxists would focus on the determining role of the economic base. But for Althusser, both approaches got it wrong.
So if knowledge isn't about a subject just grasping the essence of an object, what is it for Althusser?
It's produced by an internal process within science itself. He called it theoretical practice.
Okay.
So sciences begin with existing concepts, which he called genera, and these can be ideological or pre-scientific. Theoretical practice involves applying the specific theory of that science, its unique set of concepts and methods, to these genera. And through this process, you transform ideological generalities into scientific generalities. It's all happening within the realm of thought, although it does engage with existing materials and facts.
But those facts are never just raw data. They're already shaped by some conceptual framework. Right?
Actually, think of a scientific experiment. You start with certain ideas and tools, the theory. You apply them to a specific phenomenon, the genera. And through that process, you produce new knowledge.
Okay, so it's an active, transformative process.
Very much so. And he pointed to specific moments in history as examples of these epistemological breaks.
What did he call them?
Epistemological breaks, yeah. Times when a new science emerges with its own unique way of understanding the world, like Galileo's development of modern physics, the emergence of Greek mathematics, and of course Marx's founding of historical materialism. He drew a lot from the work of French historical epistemologists like Canguilhem, Bachelard, and Coiret, who all emphasized these breaks in thinking.
Now, a really important concept in Marx, and therefore central to Althusser's reading of Marx, is the mode of production. How did he understand that?
So for Althusser, Marx's concept of the mode of production is his fundamental insight.
Okay.
It's the basis for understanding all forms of activity within a society, material and intellectual.
Right.
And it's not limited to just economic production. It also includes ideological production, political production, even philosophical production. It's like the underlying operating system of a society. It shapes how a society produces and reproduces its existence, its material reality, and its ways of thinking.
And within this framework of the mode of production, he develops key concepts like structural causality, overdetermination, and uneven development. These seem to add a layer of complexity to those more traditional Marxist ideas of economic determinism, right?
They do. So structural causality emphasizes the influence of the structure as a whole.
Hmm.
The structure of the mode of production, that is. It influences all of its different parts, but not in a simple cause and effect kind of way. It's more about the overall system, creating the conditions and setting the limits for what can happen within it.
Okay, so it's not like the economy is a puppet master controlling everything directly.
Right. Instead of the economy being a puppet master directly pulling the strings of politics and culture, Althusser suggests the entire system of economy, politics, and ideology creates the conditions and sets the limits for what can happen. Now, overdetermination is a concept he borrowed from Freud. It suggests that every element within a social formation, economic, political, ideological, all of them, are shaped by all the others. So contradictions within a society aren't simple. They're overdetermined, meaning they're intensified and shaped by multiple forces all interacting with each other. Think of a protest movement. It's not just fueled by one economic grievance. It's also driven by social inequalities, political frustrations, maybe cultural shifts. All these factors together overdetermine the situation.
I see.
And then uneven development recognizes that different aspects of a mode of production don't develop at the same speed or in the same way.
All right.
You could have very advanced capitalist elements existing alongside, say, more traditional social forms.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. And what about the idea of a structure and dominance?
Ah, yeah.
Yeah.
That refers to the element within the overall structure that has the most organizing influence on the other practices.
Hmm.
Althusser argued that in many modern societies, it's the economic practice that plays this dominant role.
Okay.
Commodity production and consumption. It shapes things like moral values, scientific knowledge, even family structures. But he also pointed out that in other historical periods, a different practice could be dominant, like the production and spread of religious beliefs in feudalism.
Okay, so the dominant structure can change over time.
Exactly. Now, all of this feeds into his social and political philosophy, which includes his well-known concept of anti-humanism. This one often raises eyebrows.
Yeah, it's a provocative term. What did he mean by it exactly?
So Althusser's anti-humanism was a rejection of the idea that there's this pre-given universal human nature that exists outside of specific social and economic relations.
Okay.
He argued that our very ideas about what it means to be human are themselves historically produced ideologies that serve to reproduce the existing social order.
Hmm.
There's no essential human that then enters into society. Instead, individuals are shaped by these social and productive relations. Our ideas about freedom, equality, even the state, they're not universal truths. They're products of specific historical conditions.
So those really fundamental concepts we often take for granted aren't timeless. They're actually constructs that serve a specific social purpose.
Exactly.
Wow.
He saw these ideas as ideologies that help maintain the existing power structures by making them seem natural and inevitable.
Oh,
And his philosophy of history followed this line of thinking. He rejected those teleological views, the idea that history has a predetermined goal.
right, like communism or some perfect state of freedom.
Right. For Althusser, history is a process without a subject or goal. There are patterns, there are transformations, but there's no inherent direction or ultimate purpose guiding it.
Hmm.
Changes happen because of the interplay of contradictions within a given mode of production, but there's no guarantee of progress or a predetermined endpoint.
Okay, so this is Althusser's classic work, a real intellectual shakeup. But as we mentioned earlier, it did receive some criticism, and Althusser himself later revisited and revised some of his core ideas. What prompted that shift in his thinking?
Well, there were numerous criticisms directed at his classic work.
What?
Some people argued that it was too abstract, too idealist, too focused on theoretical constructs and not enough on the realities of material life. Others saw it as a kind of philosophical justification for Stalinist dogmatism,
Hmm.
rigidly sticking to one interpretation of Marx. And then there were accusations that he disregarded what Marx himself said about his own methodology and key concepts,
Hmm.
and that his account of the relationship between theory and practice was, well, underdeveloped.
So he wasn't immune to critique.
Definitely not. But he did engage with these criticisms in his later work, especially from the late 1960s through the 1970s.
And what were some of the key changes during this period?
Well, you see a renewed focus on Lenin.
Uh-huh.
His 1967 seminar, Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of Scientists, was a turning point.
Okay.
He started to move away from that strict separation of different theoretical practices, and acknowledge that ideology actually influences all forms of thought, even scientific concepts. He argued that the boundary between scientific and ideological concepts wasn't as clear-cut as he'd initially suggested.
That's a pretty big departure from his earlier insistence on the epistemological break and the idea of pure, objective scientific knowledge.
It is. He also revised his understanding of the relationship between theory and practice.
In what way?
Well, he started to argue that philosophy had this crucial role to play in examining the ideological elements that are embedded in scientific concepts. Materialist philosophers could help scientists identify and challenge those ideological influences. The goal wasn't to find some absolute truth, but to develop more accurate or correct ideas that could guide political action.
Okay, so a more practical, pragmatic approach.
Yeah, you say that. And this period also saw the development of his really influential theory of ideological interpolation.
Right, from his essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses.
Exactly. This theory tries to explain how individuals become subjects within a certain social order, how we come to understand ourselves and our place in the world.
Yeah.
He argued that this process happens through being hailed or interpellated by what he called ideological state apparatuses.
Okay.
Things like family, education, the church, media.
Right, those institutions that shape our worldview.
Yes. These institutions provide us with the categories and identities and norms through which we make sense of ourselves and the world. And by internalizing these categories and participating in these institutions, we become subjects who basically accept and reproduce the existing social structures.
So ideology isn't just a set of abstract ideas, it actually shapes our sense of self.
Exactly. It's about how we come to recognize ourselves within the frameworks provided by these institutions.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. He also explored aesthetic theory during this time. He saw authentic art, particularly through the work of Brecht, as having the potential to create a critical distance between how we normally understand the world and the reality beneath those understandings.
Okay.
To open up space for questioning, for the possibility of change.
Interesting. And towards the end of this revision period in 1978, he wrote Marx in His Limits. This suggests an even deeper reevaluation of Marx's work, right?
It does. In this essay, Althusser argued that even in Marx's mature writings, you can find materialist and idealist concepts all mixed up. And many of his key ideas remained, underdeveloped or even contradictory. He admitted that Marx never fully escaped Hegel's influence,
Right,
or the concept of human alienation. However, instead of just giving up on Marx, Althusser proposed a way to evaluate Marx's concepts based on how effective they'd been in the history of actual Marxist movements.
Okay, so a more pragmatic test based on real-world outcomes.
Yeah, he suggested that by focusing on the concepts that had actually been useful in struggles for social change, we could arrive at a more robust and less dogmatic form of Marxism, one that acknowledges its own limitations and doesn't rely on these grand narratives of historical progress.
Okay, so this brings us to Althusser's last phase of work, from 1980 to 1986, and his development of aleatory materialism, or the materialism of the encounter. This sounds like another major shift, especially considering what was happening in his personal life at the time.
It was. This was a period of intense personal crisis for him.
Yeah.
But intellectually, he identified what he called an underground tradition in philosophy.
An underground tradition.
Thinkers like Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius, Machiavelli, Spinoza, and of course Marx.
Okay, quite a diverse group. And what did they have in common?
They all rejected teleology. That's the idea that things have a predetermined purpose.
Right.
And what he called the principle of reason. This is the idea that the universe or history unfolds according to a pre-established rational order.
Okay, so what are the key principles of this aleatory materialism?
First, matter is the only reality. Second, chance, or the aleatory, is the primary force in the creation of all worlds and everything we see within them. And third, new orders and structures emerge contingently from these chance encounters between already existing material elements.
Okay.
So even seemingly stable structures are ultimately the product of these chance encounters that just happen to solidify. These encounters aren't predetermined. It's a matter of chance whether they happen and whether they take, leading to a new configuration, or whether they fail and the old order persists.
So even the solid structures of society and history are, at their core, the result of random interactions.
That's the idea. And he connected this to his political philosophy.
How so?
He emphasized the contingent nature of political orders. He drew on thinkers like Rousseau and Hobbes, but especially Machiavelli, who really understood how precarious political power is.
Right.
Althusser argued that the role of the materialist philosopher is to recognize this contingency, to understand that things could have been different and that they can be different in the future,
I see.
and to envision the potential for radical transformation, even if the exact outcomes remain unpredictable.
So a much less deterministic view than his earlier work.
Yeah, much more open-ended.
It acknowledges the limits of trying to predict the future.
It does. It stresses the role of chance in shaping both the natural and social world. It's a philosophy that highlights the potential for unexpected change emerging from, well, from unforeseen encounters and events.
So we've traced Althusser's intellectual journey from his early engagement with Christianity and Hegel through his influential structuralist Marxism to this final exploration of aleatory materialism. It's a complex, constantly evolving body of work. What are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they walk away with?
I think the main point is that even though his work is intricate, his impact is undeniable.
Yeah.
His work, especially his theory of ideology, continues to be incredibly valuable across many different fields. He challenged traditional understandings of Marxism, provided new ways of interpreting philosophical and political texts, and most importantly, he forced us to think critically about those often invisible structures that shape how we think and how our societies are organized. He reminds us that even our most fundamental beliefs and understandings aren't necessarily self-evident or natural.
Right, they're shaped by all these forces we might not even be aware of.
Exactly.
And even though his work has been controversial, the current reevaluation, particularly in light of his later writings, suggests that his ideas are still relevant and raise some important questions.
Absolutely. He makes us confront the frameworks, the ideologies that shape our understanding of the world.
Hmm.
And his later emphasis on the role of chance in history encourages us to think about the uncertainties we face and the unpredictable possibilities for change that might emerge from unexpected places.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the thought of a truly complex and influential figure. And as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a question. Considering Althusser's emphasis on those hidden structures that shape our thoughts and the role of chance in history, how might this perspective change your understanding of the challenges we face today, both socially and politically?
And what about the potential avenues for transformation?
Yeah, how might this new perspective open up new possibilities for thinking about change? That's something to ponder until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us.